Commemorating Karbala is not just a ritual, as we've mentioned in the previous nights, and it's not just an information session either. It's not a place just to gather facts. Rather, it is a time for transformation through the use of emotion and spiritual connection to the Imam, to his values, to his personality. And this atmosphere of lamentation and of sadness that we evoke each year during this time primes the soul for spiritual revivification, spiritual rectification, spiritual transformation. Just as when an individual who has many years of sins on his back, and he comes to realize the weight and the burden that he's carrying, and he prays to God in the middle of the night, recognizing his sins, and tears flow down his cheeks. It is that grief that turns him to true repentance. It's repentance of the tongue, speaking to God and telling him, Astaghfirullah, shouldn't have done that, is only one step of the process. But when the accumulation of sins, or the recognition of one's poverty before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes great enough that the individual begins to cry, it is that sadness and that grief and that sense of despair for one's own position in front of his Lord that moves him to transform himself. And similarly, commemorating the march and the tragedy of Abu Abdullah is a way for us to measure ourselves up against a more pure soul, the most pure of souls. We listen to the steadfastness, the perseverance of the Imam and his companions. We listen to and learn about the khutbahs that the Imam gave, calling people to oneness, calling people to oneness and wholeness of community, away from the dispersion of the community under the Umayyad project. And then you look in the mirror and you think, how do I measure up against that? And perhaps you find that you don't measure up very well at all. None of us measure up to Abu Abdullah. But that grief that we feel for him, that connection that we create with him, should lead us to then recognize that we don't measure up, and that we can, though, move forward and come closer to the footsteps and the personality of Imam al-Husayn. And so last night we spoke about the need to create a unified community vision. And we spoke about how each organization is profoundly influenced by the spiritual and educational state of the founders of a particular organization and the people who work within that organization. So, when people who set the goals of an organization have a weak understanding of Islamic principles, then the fruit born by that organization will reflect weak Islamic principles. When the individuals who run an organization or found an organization are dominated by materialistic inclinations and they have not reformed themselves, then those institutions will produce dunyawi and materialistic products. We see some organizations popping up in the United States that use the word Muslim in them, or use the word Islamic in them, and they hold dance parties, and they have music parties, and they have men and women getting together and under the guise of a networking program, and then they engage in haram activities. And so you see the fruit born by the organization most likely reflects the people who put the institution together and set the tone for the institution. We see this in the history of Karbala. Yazid was the caliph of the Umayyad project, the Umayyad regime. The very regime that slaughtered the grandson of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this wasn't Yazid's first act of sin. He himself was an openly sinful individual. He was known to be a drunkard. He was known to be an individual who visited brothels. He was known to be somebody with a violent tendency. This isn't somebody who was struggling with his nafs and trying to reform himself. He was open and brazen about his own wretchedness. And in turn, as caliph, as in a sense the leader of a particular organization, He then appointed and gathered people like himself, say birds of a feather flock together. He brought openly impious, sinful people to run the institutions of his government. We have Ibn Ziyad, who threatened to kill the families of the rebels, not just the rebels themselves, but he also threatened to kill the families, the wives, and the children of the rebels under his governorship. Similarly, we see that today, Trump presides as the President of the United States. Government institutions are in turmoil. It seems like every month there's some new article from insiders within the administration saying that we're trying to keep, anonymously, we're trying to keep tabs and keep check on the damage that Trump may bring about. Each day there's some new drama that's tweeted out from Trump himself. And it seems like there's each week a Trump associate who is convicted of corruption or convicted of some crime of some sort. And again, this was not unknown about Trump. The people who brought Trump into power knew about his open profligacy, his open immorality. It wasn't a secret that he had open misogynistic views, open racist views, and that he was a liar. Every other week he had a new talking point, and he flipped it, and a member of the media would ask him, but didn't you say X? And he said no. And we have a video clip of him saying exactly what the media had asked him, did he say it? To put it crudely, in sum, you say garbage in, garbage out. And this is not something that is specific to heads of state. This is not something specific to presidents and kings and those sorts of people. It's a tendency that can plague our own souls. It's what we see happen in Kufa. It's what Ibn Ziyad fed off of, the manipulation of personal desires. We have some narrations that indicate that Ibn Ziyad said to his kind of footmen, his soldiers, go amidst the people and give glad tidings to the people who are obedient to me, that we will increase their stipends and we will have more mercy upon them than upon others. And threaten the disobedient of deprivation and punishments, and inform them that the army of Sham, the army of Syria, is already marching upon them. And so we have traditions that his men went out and said, O people, return to your families. Do not hasten to evil, and do not expose yourselves to death. The army of the commander of the faithful Yazid is approaching. The governor has sworn to Allah that if you persist in your rebellion, and you do not go away by nightfall, he will deprive your children of their government stipend money. He will hold the healthy among you responsible for their sick, and he will hold the present among you responsible for those who are absent, until none of the rebellious people will remain. And nobody will avoid the evil consequences of Ibn Ziyad's punishment. So what we saw in the story of Muslim is that then women would come to their sons and brothers who were praying behind Muslim ibn Aqil and tell their sons and brothers, let's go away. Somebody else will take care of this revolution. And men would come to their sons and brothers and say, tomorrow the army of Sham is going to come against you. So what are you going to do with this war and evil? Just go away, save yourself. These were common people, like you and I. And like you and me, we weren't there, but like you and me, they had the tendencies that might make them spiritually weak, that led them to turning their backs on the Imam who they called to Kufa in the first place. So it's not just a spiritual stain on their own souls, they're putting their Imam, and forget, even if Imam Hussein wasn't the proper Imam, they're putting another man and his family in danger by leaving their pledges. They lied to them, in effect, because of their own weakness of heart. So, for us to build strong community institutions in the United States, we must all begin to put our souls in order. We have to begin to develop a spiritual fortitude, an internal fortitude, so that we are not swayed by this or that lower desires, so that we are not swayed by materialistic temptations. We must seek an inner islah, like we spoke about the other night, an internal spiritual revival of sense. And only after we have revived our spirits as a community will our institutions, our mosques, our weekend schools, our full-time schools, our charitable projects, our national projects, only after the people who run them and the community members who have built them and sustained them have been spiritually revived, will those institutions bear spiritually positive fruits. As God says in the Quran, "Inna Allah la yughayyiru ma bi qawmin hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim." Indeed, definitely, Allah will not change a people's, a group's, a community's situation, or a group or a community's lot, unless they change what is in their own souls. In other words, the community changes with a change in man's idea and his will. If the foundation of a community, meaning each member of the community, is strong and solid on the society at large. The good news is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will begin to pave a path for us, for our community, for our individual community members, so long as our community begins to run on the path themselves of spiritual revivification. It says Allah does not change a group's situation until that group changes what is in their own selves. Meaning that once people move on the path toward felicity, God will then help them on that path. He doesn't leave us alone. He only leaves us alone if we completely stay away from our responsibility of developing ourselves. So for the rest of the talk tonight, I'd like to look at 5 practical steps for spiritual rejuvenation and revivification. Some of these will be brief reminders, nothing complex, but they are simple steps that we can take that should have profound effects on our life if we implement them. So there's nothing high-minded here. They're easy things, and these are really the basis of Islamic spirituality. Islamic spirituality does not necessitate high-level intellectual analysis. The Prophet and the Imams often spoke in simple terms for the bulk of the community to begin to develop themselves. The first of these practical elements is the need for silence. We have a hadith that states, "Man samata salima." That the individual who is silent is salim, salima. He is protected, he is safe. This has many repercussions and applications in our lives. And with a little reflection, you and I can figure out what that means. We don't need a lot of analysis here. 1, the tongue can be a harmful muscle, can be a harmful organ. Some people, we say that guy has a sharp tongue. We see that argumentation hurts friendships, it hurts relationships, it hurts marriages, even if it isn't always vicious. Being around people who always like to argue, who always like to nitpick, who always like to quibble about the most basic of things, they become hard to be around. It's annoying. It can put a strain on that friendship, that bond of brotherhood that we're supposed to have. Argumentation spoils that. And so thinking before you speak and holding back your tongue, not speaking so much, is of utmost importance. The tongue can also be vulgar and can be obscene. And obscenities have an impact not only on the people we say them to, but they have an impact on our own hearts. When we use obscenities and vulgarities over and over, and we listen to obscenities and vulgarities over and over, they change the way we react and think. If you can think back to the wonder years when you were a young kid, the first bad word you learned, the first obscenity you learned, it becomes, as a kind of a young rebellious kid, it becomes a part of your vocabulary, and it replaces more high-minded ways of reacting. When you use vulgarities, you're usually using them as stand-ins for more dignified ways of expressing yourself. So you avoid being vulnerable, you insert a vulgarity. You avoid being truthful and honest, you insert a vulgarity. Not to mention when you use them against other people, they destroy friendships just like argumentation does. Just like we said the other night, high-minded poetry can expand one's horizons of possibility. It can push you to change yourself, transform your life. Listening to Quran can make you ready for self-sacrifice or self-renewal. As in an opposite way, constant use of obscene language and vulgar language rewires us in the opposite way. It shrinks our conception of what we can be. It kind of stipends our way of communicating with other people, because we use simple language to express our feelings. And third is that talking too much is a preoccupation. It distracts us from other activities we could be engaged in. Silence, in some hadith we say it's awwal al-ibadah. It is kind of a prerequisite or a first step of worship itself. We mentioned the other day that it's a recommendation to sit down on your prayer mat and just sit in silence for 2 or 3 minutes before you begin your salah, to remind yourself of the enormity of the Lord that you're about to stand in front of the enormity and the depth of the meaning of salah itself. So silence is a prerequisite for khushu' and focus and humility in your worship. Silence is a prerequisite to do muhasibah, to reflect on your own inner state, and to take account of yourself. Silence is a prerequisite for reflecting on Allah's attributes. Silence is a prerequisite for planning and strategizing. If you're part of a community organization, or for work, or for your family's sake, or whatever it is you need to plan for. Some people like to talk out their plans. But it's best if you stay silent for a moment and think about what you're going to say, and then converse and have a shura with somebody else, get advice with somebody else. But you want to have something to say first. And by the way, this extends to all forms of communication. So we can perhaps think of silence of the thumbs. We look at Trump, constantly tweeting, and probably regretting half of the things he tweets because it gets him in trouble. Perhaps you've gotten in trouble texting something mean to a family member, to a loved one, to a friend, because it was just quick and easy. Maybe it was at a stoplight. You wanted to text something really quickly, you say it kind of rashly, you hurt their feelings. You want to argue with a brother on Facebook. You get on your computer and you lash out at somebody. So silence of the tongue, the kernel is really silencing communication, rolling back communication. The second thing we'd like to talk about is to avoid eating too much and to try to eat right. Again, we're talking about elements of basic and simple practices we can begin to develop our spiritual lives. To avoid eating too much and to try to eat correctly. So overeating obviously often creates kind of a dullness of the intellect, a dullness of the soul. It makes us tired. It makes us slow. So we can think about iftars during the month of Ramadan. You go from one extreme of extreme hunger, you overeat during iftar, and the month of Ramadan is the month of prayer, the month of recitation of Quran. Then we eat too much and we can't recite because we can't think. All we want to do is turn on Netflix, take a nap, and then then we can't wake for Fajr. We ate too much. Our digestive system is on overdrive during the evening, during the night. I spoke to one scholar who said that he was counseling a brother over the course of several years. The young brother couldn't wake up for Fajr. He was having a very difficult time. And so the scholar gave the brother various dhikrs and du'as and different ways to try to help him wake up for Fajr. He told him, make an intention before you go to sleep. You'll wake up for Fajr after that. And over the course of several years, the brother couldn't create a habit of it. And he began to develop a sense of spiritual despair. So he thought, maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I'm not good enough to wake up for Fajr. And so the scholar was also doing his PsyD. He was doing his PhD in psychology. And he began taking a class on psychology and nutrition. And something clicked for him. He called the brother and he said, cut out sugar for 2 weeks and then call me. Try to wake up just as you have usually been doing. Cut out sugar, see if it changes anything. 2 weeks later, the brother said that was the trick. The brother didn't tell him he was drinking sodas at night before he was going to bed, and all throughout the day. And one of the things the scholar had learned in his PsyD program is that sugar can create a problem for sleep. And we find in some hadith, the imams were also asked about diet-related issues. So I can't know enough to tell you how to eat correctly, but for sure you can analyze how food affects you and see how it affects your spiritual life. Cut out things that creates a problem for you. We have a hadith that indicate that you should fill the stomach with 1/3 water, 1/3 food, 1/3 air. And that means that we have to stop eating before we feel full. And that's a problem for most of us because my mother used to tell me, you eat with your eyes. Fill up a big plate, you think you're going to eat it all, and you overstuff yourself. One way to pull back on one's food intake is to chew your food well, which is also a sunnah, it's a recommendation. We tend to kind of inhale food, wolf it down. Chew it well. Chew 7, 10, 12, 20 times in the same morsel before you swallow. And that allows the body time to recognize the feeling of satiation before you've eaten too much. There's also another recommendation to eat with other people, not to eat alone. And perhaps engaging in conversation and community, communing with your brothers and sisters or your family while you're eating, perhaps the motions of discussing, talking about your day, kind of hold you back from inhaling your food at the very moment. When you're sitting and watching a game or watching a movie, you just kind of mindlessly eat. But when you're communing with other people, saying, pass the food, pass this, you're more in tune with how your body's reacting to it. The third recommendation is to make time for yourself to contemplate during the day. And this is related to silence, but it's a separate issue. Spend 10 to 15 minutes a day sitting quietly. You can do it on your prayer mat after your prayer. You can do it on your porch, in your garden. You can do it 15 minutes before going to bed. And this can certainly be a luxury in our busy world with our busy schedules, but probably we can all cut out a couple of minutes of social media time here, a couple of minutes of Netflix there, a couple of minutes of YouTube there, a couple of minutes of watching the game, and get 10 to 15 minutes of good contemplation time. If you're totally strapped for time, then do it in your car. Do it when you're at work. Find a time to sit for 10 or 15 minutes. To reflect on your blessing with his lower desires. And Al-Tabatabai wrote him a letter, and he said, at the time of sleeping, you should spend 4 or 5 minutes thinking about the actions that you've performed throughout the day. You should consider each action one by one by one. Whichever actions you find were in accordance with Allah's divine commands, then thank Allah for that. Whichever actions you found were transgressions against Allah, then ask and seek for forgiveness. And to add to that, don't just think about kind of clear sins. There's one thing to say, okay, I have a clear sin here, I didn't pray, and there's a clear good thing I did, I prayed. That's too simple. But keep tabs on your emotional health. Keep tabs on your akhlaqi health. Were you angry today? Yes or no? And why? Was it right to do, or was it not right to do? Did you talk too much? Did you eat too much, as the things we've just spoken about? Note those more subtle elements of your spiritual life and keep tabs on them. See what things you've developed over time. Perhaps have a notebook, have a journal. Just hide it from people. You don't want people to know. And think about the things, the good things you've done. The fourth thing is to spend time with friends and family members who remind you of Allah and avoid people who distract you from Allah. And this can be a difficult, especially for younger people, this can be a difficult thing to implement because it can potentially mean cutting out certain types of friendships and relationships. But at the most basic level, keeping community with pious people helps you to remind yourselves again of the basics. When you're out with Muslim friends and prayer time's running out, they'll remind you, hey guys, let's go pray. But if you're out with friends who don't pray, even if they're Muslim, you're more liable to miss your prayer, for instance. If you're out with Muslim friends, you're less likely to use harsh obscenities. When you're out with non-Muslim friends, their language is going to rub off on you. And this community element is part of why we need to build much stronger community centers. Right? It's a reciprocal relationship. Our own internal spiritual revival will launch us into better community institutions, and similarly, more positive and strong community institutions will create stronger hearts and souls in Muslims. And the last piece of advice that the scholars mention is to set aside each time to study. Set aside a time each week to study. For our community institutions to flourish, yes, we need people with revived hearts and souls. We need pious people, but we also need educated people. So if you're good at self-study, then read the books of our ulama. Read the articles of our ulama. Take notes on them. Don't read them like you would read a Facebook post. Take notes on them. Summarize them. Try to retain the information as much as you can. If you're somebody who prefers to listen to lectures, then find lecture series. Scrolling around on YouTube and looking at random lectures isn't going to give you any comprehensive education. But some of our ulama have lecture series that you can watch on tafsir, aqaid, and various other subjects. And if you're going to listen to lectures, then again, take notes. Write your insights. Journal about the lectures. Don't just listen to them passively. Don't just listen to them while you're driving, or some brothers that listen to lectures while they're working out. That's fine to do, but if you want to have a serious set of study, then take notes. Summarize the books. And if you're not good at self-study, or if it's not your preference, then set up a book club with your friends. That will encourage you to learn together and to summarize and reflect on the teachings in real time. So if you're not a good note taker, or you don't like to journal for yourselves, then learning and then reading and then getting together with a group of friends and discussing the book that you've all read together, or the article or the chapter that you've all read together, is a good way to retain that information and then to put it into practice, inshallah. Of course, if your local area has local classes, you have teachers, take advantage of that. And if you don't have that benefit, then look for online classes you can join. Inshallah, pray that we will have better institutes of education into the future, inshallah.